work. And these alliances are operating on the regional level. Plus, there are new product lines such as Premium Market Initiative. I'd like to bring here the important role our regions have played in moving the Global Tiger Initiative and the biodiversity agenda forward, the role of the SDN anchor in actually supporting the whole project, World Bank Institute for permitting me to sit in the tiger den there and to do this kind of stuff. So thank you very much for that. IEG for actually picking up an extremely important issue of tiger conservation and habitat integrity, and really coming out with a very frank and extremely positive report on what should be the World Bank role in doing this. And of course, our finance finance department and the executive from the President's office and EXT. There are now new demands to use GTI as a replicable model in other things, for big apes, for leopards in MENA and other places, and we are looking at these possibilities. These I have already talked about. I think these GTI's basic objectives are very well aligned to where we are located today at the WBI, because it is an extremely important capacity building partnership. However, and I want to end here by saying that all this is happening, but the situation on the ground really need persistence, consistency, and sometimes I talk about direct action. We need to really make a difference in terms of this integrity of core habitats. These habitats are, every day we are losing these habitats. They are being fractured. Ministers have made actually a statement that they cannot protect corridors. And this habitat loss is actually leading to these small patches where tigers and wildlife is left. It's a huge issue. It is continuing. It is happening in Karachi. There are 4 roads planned in Sumatra, which our country director and others are trying to stop. There is a road going on through the core tiger habitat in Laos, with the country director is again taken up a major issue there. There are roads in Bhutan where the Prime Minister himself said, look, we need to redesign it. So there is this pressure on core habitat and the pressure of induced urbanization. I have talked about illegal trade and wildlife. These poachers are now hiring choppers, using rifles with infrared sights, and shooting them in South Africa and other things. You must have read the Time magazine report on rhino poaching. In operation of half an hour, you can pick up 10 rhinos, make $1 million on their horn, and just disappear through choppers. So it's extremely important to understand that. Last issue is transnational coordination and resource mobilization. We still have to do a lot of work on resource mobilization. We are working with SDN on a multi-donor trust fund, and we have to do a lot of work on transnational coordination. Now, I'd like to thank you. This picture was again taken in Corbett. And what we wanted to show to you, that the path that the young sub-adult tiger was taking is quite opposite to the path the boot of the human being was. And unless we align them with your help, we will never be able to succeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Keshav, for this very emotional and rich presentation. So now on our program we have a very rich panel of colleagues whom we would like to offer their insights into what actually all this is meaning to their day-to-day work, to their work in the operations, in the anchor, and elsewhere. And I think the majority of invited speakers here are internal to the bank, but we also have Eric Dinerstein from the outside. So we are a bit behind schedule, so we have about, I think, 9 speakers here. we would like all of them to speak, and we would also like to have some time for some Q&As afterward. So let's start, and I'm asking each of the presenters to be brief and to really kind of give the main highlights of where they see this initiative as being helpful to their day-to-day work. Okay. So, Dr. Eric Dinerstein. So, everybody should feel free to speak from their mics, but if you want to stand up here, please do so.
Thanks. I'm sorry for jumping ahead, Richard. I got to give a lecture at Georgetown in a few minutes, so this will. I'm Eric Dinerstein. I'm the chief scientist at the World Wildlife Fund and a core member of the Global Tiger Initiative. I suppose there's an unwritten rule that for a member of an NGO to offer praise to the World Bank spells excommunication. But at the risk of that, I'd like to praise the World Bank and the Global Tiger Initiative for taking a major role in our efforts to save tigers and to double the number of tigers in 12 years. Without the World Bank and without the Global Tiger Initiative and Kesav's leadership, quite frankly, we wouldn't be half where we are today. When we were at the Global Tiger Summit that Kesav referred to, which was the first time there was ever a summit for an endangered species, Pavan Sukhdev, many of you know him from the TEEB report, a very brilliant thinker about ecosystem services, made a very astute point. He said, well, tigers are the most popular animals on Earth, so why in the world do we need a global tiger summit for them? Well, of course, they're the most popular animals on Earth if you poll somebody from the West. But if you poll somebody who lives next to Chitwan National Park or Hue Ka Keng in Thailand, you won't get the same result. So people who live next to tigers have a very different view of them. And it's because of that that some people question that can one be pro-poor and pro-tiger at the same time? So since this is the World Bank, I'd like to leave you with a couple of thoughts of why not only is that essential to be both, but that one won't work without the other. The first is that if you look at natural resource management in Asia, it's pretty obvious that conserving tigers conserves the habitat, as Kesav said. But even more importantly, if we dig down into the numbers, we find, for example, that carbon, which used to be boring old carbon, now is all of a sudden has mojo because of carbon markets and global climate change, is that tiger habitats on average conserve 3.5 times as much carbon as areas that lack tigers. So right away we have a target for what we need to do to save natural resources. And second is that of the 7 major rivers in Asia, all of them have their headwaters starting or flow through critical tiger habitats. So if we want to conserve watersheds, have water provisioning, address water crisis in the future, you have to be not only pro-tiger habitat if you want to be pro-poor. Another aspect is this year I've been asked to co-edit a volume for the 25th anniversary of the Society for Conservation Biology and our journal Conservation Biology, of which many of you are subscribers. And what I've put together is a panel of sort of conservation biology futurists to look at the next 25 years. What are the big drivers of biodiversity loss? What are the opportunities for conservation? And there's a theme, I'll give you sort of the headline that will be, this will be available in December, this issue, but the theme that runs through most of these papers is that the future of biodiversity conservation, not just tiger conservation, comes down to good governance. And I would submit that there is a high correlation between good governance of natural resources and conservation of tigers, of low corruption, of better management of resources, and a greater opportunity for the poorest people on Earth to exploit those resources to develop and improve their livelihoods. So one can't go without the other. As Kesav said, you lose the tigers, and it's pretty easy to measure how rapidly these ecosystems degrade. There's another important aspect, too, which is that tigers and conservation can be an opportunity for innovation. So Kesav mentioned the opportunity of innovation through the wildlife premium market, and I'd just like to say a word about that. First, that the idea is quite simple. It's that carbon credits linked to a charismatic species that lives in the forest that contain that carbon are actually worth much more on the open market and to those who want to buy those carbon credits and wildlife credits than places that lack such charismatic carbon. That's the hypothesis that we're about to test in places like the Terai Arc of Nepal, in Thailand, in Bangladesh, where using this approach of linking carbon credits and wildlife restoration, we get a higher price that goes back to communities, and it's a win-win-win with co-benefits of stabilizing the climate, restoring forests, improving natural resource management, empowering communities, and reaching restoration targets to getting us to T times 2. I should point out that it wasn't the president of an NGO, a conservation NGO, that started promoting the wildlife premium. It was Mr. Zellick, first in Nagoya, then at St. Petersburg, and then in Cancun, and who has also helped provide us with the seed funding to start some of these pilots that will really be worth keeping your eye on for those who work in the World Bank and in the greater world of conservation. So, very quickly then, is that creating these linkages between natural resource management, improving rural livelihoods, and restoring the emblematic species of Asia, I think will have broad implications for conservation and development in the years to come. But I'd like to lay down one more marker, and that is that if we as a species can learn to not only coexist but help recover rarities like tigers, that it will be a marker in the cultural evolution of our own species and will we have proceeded to the next level. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. So, of course, Eric is one of the sort of founding fathers intellectually and otherwise for the Global Tiger Initiative. Another one such person is our own Richard Damania, who has recently left us for the better pastures in Latin America. But together with John Seidensticker of the Smithsonian Institute, who unfortunately is not with us today, he was one of the two main authors of the seminal first publication, Future for Wild Tigers, which really provided the underpinning for our future work. So, Richard, please.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Eric Dennerstein and Keshav are always very hard acts to follow, so let me be very brief and just make a couple of points. Firstly, on the GTI, it is really quite marvelous that it's acted as a catalyst and we're all here together worrying about and concerned about a single species, the tiger. It's also quite remarkable, as Sanjay said, that it's acted as a catalyst outside the bank, bringing prime ministers together, etc., etc. But there is, as Keshav said, one lingering concern, one lingering doubt. In all of these things, we keep talking to the converted. We're always preaching to the converted, always preaching to conservationists. And indeed, as I look around me in my room, I really see a lot of people really from that general sector, the environment sector, or people that have concerns about it. So let me try to turn the question a little bit on its head, a little bit the way Eric was trying to approach it, very, very briefly, and argue why it is that we should actually save tigers, even if you didn't really care about tigers, even if you thought this was a special interest, and even if you didn't really worry too much about ecosystems and particular species. I think the most compelling argument for it is the fact that if we look at the globe, if we look at the Earth as a rule, the surface of the Earth as a whole, less than 6% of the Earth's surface is defined as protected area. That's less than 6% of the Earth's surface. This is not just tigers, this is everything altogether. So, if we are not allowed to solve, if we're not able to solve problems of poverty, problems of development with access to 95% of the Earth, clearly you're not going to be able to do it by destroying the last 5%. There are lots of economists around here, we've all heard of diminishing returns. There are clearly negative returns to converting more habitat into, be it roads, whatever else you might think of, urban areas, or whatever else they may be. So I'll put that down as point number one for everyone to try to beat down and say that it is wrong, because it's factually accurate. And I think that's one of the more compelling arguments that we can provide. Now, if we buy that argument, where does that leave us, both as a bank, as a development organization, and more broadly? I think in many ways it might ask us to really rethink a lot of the way we actually do development. And I think we can think of a paradigm shift, and I think we have a lot of opportunities to do that right now. For example, there's a green growth report that's coming out, and we could try to address some of these issues no matter how gently in some of the reports that are actually coming out. It also has implications, and it's wonderful to see the GTI taking this issue on, of green infrastructure. What does green infrastructure actually mean? How how might the bank in practical terms begin to try to do infrastructure? And might I put down another point that is largely neglected is perhaps we might think of even reviving some of our offset policies that we actually have but very seldom evoke and actually use. That takes me to my next point, and I'll end very quickly now. How do we actually save tigers? Keshav pointed out that really the way we've been trying to save tigers and many other species in Asia, and I have to emphasize this is really a comment about Asia, all of Asia, South and East Asia, varies very little from what we've been doing for 50 or 60 years. The approach to conservation has been a very simple one. You declare an area as a national park, and then you have fences and fines to try to keep everyone out of the national park. And of course, that simply doesn't work, particularly when you have the kind of economic pressures that Keshav pointed out. You can make about $10,000 or more on a tiger, and you can make much, much more money on other aspects of the forest that you actually have. Of course, there's very little concern, and it's unfortunate Erik Dinnerstein had to leave, very little attention and concern given to corridors. If we don't have corridors, you're not going to get large species like tigers surviving in the long run. It's just a biological fact. They need to interbreed, otherwise you get inbreeding, even if you can preserve them. The corridors are being decayed by infrastructure, by cities, etc., etc. What I will point out is not a single tiger range country has attempted to pilot anything else in over 50 years. When one looks around oneself to other regions and other countries, you see innovations and attempted pilots elsewhere. On my left, I have one of the fathers of payment for environmental services sitting over there. Not a single tiger range country has attempted anything like that. There are conservation leases that have been attempted with, I would suggest, at least reasonable success in what they can actually achieve. There are partnerships, there are collective partnerships, there's conservation mosaics that look at an entire landscape as being the heavy protected area and a corridor, and you have different kinds of policies, different ownership regimes, etc., across the different mosaic of conservation. None of that enters anywhere in the tiger range. So what can perhaps the GTI do? What might perhaps WBI do, since we've got a vice president from there? Might I suggest one of the first things we could initiate is something like a South-South learning and even a North-South learning. And might I also suggest this would not be a one-off event, but it would actually be a process, because when it's a one-off event, people just go there, they're enthused, but then of course the enthusiasm dies out. And these are complex things that have complex political dimensions. Might also suggest that what we want to try to do is to consider what the alternatives might be, and I think there's lots of sort of new products coming out in the bank where we can begin to look more deeply when these different models can apply, if they would apply in Asia, and what the context might be and what the success might be. Let me conclude over there by saying all up, the achievements of the GTI, when it started, I don't think anyone would have believed what actually started and where it's actually ended up. I was there with Keshav when it started up. And congratulations to the whole team for everything that they have achieved, and it's been a pleasure being involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So now we have Vinod Thomas, Director General of the IEG. Vinod has been taking very strong passion for the subject and was instrumental in this review that was already referenced. Vinod, please.
Thank you very much, Andre. Following Richard, I'll also make some brief comments. First, to pay tribute to this wonderful meeting and the gathering of people, I'm sure with diverse interests, but all focused on biodiversity and the mainstreaming of that into development and the saving of the tiger. Great points have been made, Sanjay and Keshav and Erik and Richard. Let me just start with an angle on the strength of the World Bank Group in actually taking this issue on and the willingness to learn from the past. So here, I want to mention two evaluations very, very briefly. One is on the do no harm side. Projects that are not directly related to tiger conservation or biodiversity could do harm to the biodiversity agenda, and do no harm and how that has worked. The other is an example from the do good, the GTI I would put on that side of the ledger. On the first one, we took a look, and this is the strength of the institution. It was asked by the leadership of the bank group, and in response we took a look at 20 closed World Bank supported projects near tiger habitats in Asia, and these had the potential to damage protected natural habitats, so heavily infrastructure and rural development projects. what it found was not very different from what we found in a bigger evaluation of safeguards and standards in the bank group, that upfront look at the threat and the mitigation measures being considered upfront. The bank group has done well, and the countries have also featured that in the projects. Where the problems have been more heavily featured were on three-quarters of the projects evaluated prepared adequate mitigation plans, whereas 1/3 did not take the follow-up adequate steps to address the indirect impacts. So there lies the issue of follow-up and also even just knowing what happens in these infrastructure projects with respect to their impact on biodiversity. One difficult question was, where does the responsibility of a project end? For instance, Sanjay mentioned the cross-country transboundary issues, illegal trade, etc. If you're doing an infrastructure project, do you take those into account? My view would be, as a holistic institution, it belongs there. How you go about doing it, of course, will need more instruments than the pure safeguards. So on the first one, both good news, strong news in terms of learning from the experience, but really a lot of action to follow in terms of taking this on board. Because if you take Keshav's numbers on infrastructure, all the do-good projects would be overwhelmed by the harm that could take place as a result of infrastructure and other projects. Number two, on the do-good side, they matter too. The example comes from a slightly different angle. We looked at, in Richard's example, protected areas, and found that, there's a counterfactual experiment that somewhat counterintuitively, if you think of pristine areas which are far from human activities and closer to town where you can have activities as well, some protection in the latter make a bigger difference. They make a bigger difference than protection far away compared to a counterfactual of no protection. You can imagine the intuition behind it, because those areas would have been completely run down. And so it is a strong support for having protection, not only in the pristine areas, but also having mixed protected areas. And this really is very close to the tiger habitat story. And lots more to be said about that. With this as a background, I want to just make three quick general comments or observations from evaluation that really seem to come in the mainstream of the discussion on the GTI and tigers. One, as people have mentioned, this is a special effort in one sense. On the other side, the mainstreaming of this across the bank group is a key. I recall a meeting years ago when Jim Wolfenson asked a corporate meeting, does anyone care about biodiversity? And there was a pin drop silence. There was no answer. Bob Zelick is a huge champion of biodiversity. The key, of course, then is that is really mainstreamed and it becomes part of region's activities. That said, I think when you have a situation like this with such huge externalities which are not naturally captured, then the need to continue the specialness with the mainstreaming remains for probably a long time. So I sometimes we take an easy way out and say it should be mainstreamed and then you back off. But I think if you recognize the nature of the problem and its externality, you will want a combination of mainstreaming, but with the special emphasis, because it doesn't get solved by the market automatically. Number two, again touched on by others, seeing this as a development issue beyond a special effort to save the tiger is really critical. And I think we have come to a point where if people had thought at one point, let's grow first and then clean up later, it's a point in economic development where it will be hard to grow without cleaning up first as well at the same time. And so that sequencing is I think people are taking this to heart with the terrible examples, whether it's from natural disasters or from agriculture disasters or food crisis. But that links very much to making this a development issue centrally. And then finally, the urgency which which I think the speakers have mentioned as well. A crisis such as the one the Tigers face often is a moment to act, and there are lots of examples, the Ohio River catching fire or the Minamata case in Japan, which then promoted activity. But a crisis can lead to desperation or to hope. And when it's desperation, it probably winds down into a wrong side of the territory. In this case, with this kind of a group and with the efforts made and with the possibility that not only the environmental ministers but the finance ministers are beginning to take note, I would like to end with a note of hope that the urgency for the Tigers will be led with hope that we can make a difference going forward, and the bank group's positioning in this is precious news. Thank you.
Very nice. Many thanks, Vinod. So let me now pass on the baton to Monsieur Bruno Leporte, our director of the WBI for Thematic Knowledge and Learning. Bruno, please.
Thank you, Andre. I don't have to emphasize enough, and all the speakers have made excellent point, the sort of how this agenda is important and critical for development, and how exciting the preservation of biodiversity is as an agenda in itself. So what I would like to do is take a slightly different perspective, which is take the perspective of capacity development. In a sense, when you think about, we are dealing with a very difficult problem here. It's a multi-country, it's a problem that affects different countries. It affects different stakeholders within those countries. It's multi-sectoral, as we just heard, and it has within each of the sectors multi-dimensions. So it's extremely difficult to solve this type of problem. And I would submit that at the core of the solution for that problem, the whole question of knowledge, the right type of knowledge and the right type of capacity for those stakeholders that are involved in dealing with biodiversity is essential. Now, if you reflect on the type of capacity development that the bank traditionally would throw at this type of problem, and you see that in a lot of our projects, you would go with training, putting some money for training, focusing on technical skills, focusing very often on individual learning, sort of the leadership and at the highest level, and also dealing in large part with government. And as we know, if you throw this type of solution in capacity development to this difficult problem, you are not going to have much result. So here we have a very interesting, and that's the thing that really personally grabs me in terms of the program. You have a very different approach to capacity development. You have one that is based on knowledge exchange. There was a suggestion on doing South-South. It's one that is really focusing on leadership and building coalition for changes. It's one that is also focusing on non-traditional audiences, and that's really at the core of the new ideas for capacity development that exist now. We are, of course, at the Institute sort of giving a lot of thought about that, but it's also the reflection that is going on, sort of following the OECD DAC reflection on aid effectiveness, and also a high-level forum in Busan this year in the fall in 2011. So what you see here is really in action a new vision for capacity development, which has basically like three dimensions or three fundamental dimensions. The first one is really how can we connect all the stakeholders to the right type of knowledge, and to do that you have to link people to various case studies and various learning that exist and so forth. But what you can do, and that was talked about earlier, and that's the most important, you link countries and you link stakeholders so that they can learn from each other directly rather than having us do that. So it's the link to knowledge, and that is very important. The second dimension of that framework is really sort of linking stakeholders among themselves. And here you see a remarkable coalition that has been built across not only the bank, as Vinod was observing, but certainly outside the bank. And it's really this multi-stakeholder dialogue and coalition for changes that has been facilitated through the efforts of GTI, which is very powerful, and you see that in action. And the third leg of the strategy is really how you connect these to investments. And here you see the beginning of a very successful approach where a lot of funding has been found through GEF project, through IDA project, and so forth. So you see these three approaches in the GTI strategy which are really quite remarkable. I was able to see through an early report in April in India about the progress of the initiative through the 13 tiger range countries, and I was absolutely amazed about the progress that have been made, because you have not only some very powerful ideas here and mobilizing political support at the top, as we saw in St. Petersburg, but you have also a very practical approach of defining follow-up actions, monitoring, to-do lists, and so forth. And I saw the type of changes that are already taken place in terms of legal framework, in terms of new institutions being built, in terms of reform process, and all of that really shows augur very well for the future of this initiative. So talking about the future, I think the team needs to continue to deepen this approach. There are a number of things that can be done in the learning space, certainly by blending different approaches to learning and bringing different type of stakeholders that can benefit from actual learning on those issues. There is as was mentioned, the process of South-South learning, which has already started in earnest, but I think there is a lot of collaboration that can be done by countries that are sharing borders, and in fact, we have seen some of that collaboration taking place, but much more can be done in terms of the South-South knowledge exchange. I also think that the innovation dimension, which is another of the platforms that WBI is now managing, offers quite some interesting prospect for us to try to identify some of the most interesting approaches in park management, in the use of technology for monitoring tigers and other species and so forth. So the innovation dimension can be very important. And the last one I would like to mention, which maybe could be given a little